All right, welcome students. Today we have with us Thomas Jay Oord, who is a theologian, a philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He is a best-selling and award-winning author, having written or edited more than 30 books. Academic influence ranks him among the most influential theologians in the 21st century. This is very cool. Oord directs doctoral programs at Northwind Theological Seminary and directs the Center for Open and Relational Theology. He's known for his research and writing on love, open and relation theology, science and religion, evil and power, and other big topics. And it's that last topic of evil and power that's going to be the focus of most of our discussion today. So welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for
Wow.
being here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation, Austin.
Yeah, me too. So today we're going to be talking about one of your most recent books, and possibly my favorite of your books. I don't know if it's going to show up in this, probably not. The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence. And the students are going to be reading your chapter on how evil ends omnipotence, which I think is a really interesting chapter. And we've just been reading David Bentley Hart's work on classical theism. So I think this is an interesting counter proposal to that more classical theistic framework in philosophy of religion. So before we get there, though, I wanted to just kind of maybe start with some introductory stuff where maybe you can tell us a little bit about your like what motivated you to become a professional theologian. It's an unusual career trajectory for a lot of people to hear about. Something I've followed too. But like I guess maybe what were the kind of big questions, maybe not just life events, but like the big initial questions that got you on this journey?
Well, I grew up in an evangelical world. I went to church often with my family. My family was sort of one of the bedrocks of our little religious community that I was a part of. I was in a little farming town. And so questions about God and trying to figure out how God was related to everyday life, that was
Mhm.
kind of part of my life as a youngster. And of course, I had questions like most everybody does. One of them is the one we're going to talk about today. If God really exists and is perfectly loving, then why doesn't God stop the horrible things that happen in the world, the
Mhm.
genuine evils, the pointless pain? But I
Yeah.
also had questions about, other religious traditions, how to make sense of my Christian upbringing, how to handle problems in the Bible that I was reading. There seemed to be some contradictions. So I had a lot of questions growing up. I went to college, ended up being a religion major, but right at the end of my college career, I took a course in philosophy of religion. And even though I was one of these, gung ho Christians who was an evangelist, sharing the four spiritual laws and all that sort of thing, I had never really tackled sophisticated arguments from atheists, agnostics, folks from other religious traditions. And in this philosophy of religion class, my last year of college, I started reading their stuff. And for the sake of intellectual honesty, I had to admit they had really good arguments, and the reasons I had to think there was a God at all weren't very good. In fact, I remember coming to pick up my fiance, who I later married and still my wife, and her getting into the car and me looking at her and saying, I just can't believe in God anymore. And here we were, she and I were both preparing to be, like pastors or some sort of ministry people. I eventually came back to belief in God, and my return was based on two big ideas. One, this kind of search for a meaning in my life and meaning in life in general. I didn't think I could have ultimate meaning if there wasn't something like a ground of meaning that most people call God. And secondly, I really thought I ought to be a loving person, that everybody ought to be loving, that in some sense, love was the answer. And I couldn't make good sense of that intuition if there wasn't something like a lover prompting that in some way. At least that's how I would have framed it at the time. And from that place, I started adding in views about God and eventually came to this open and relational process way of thinking of things. And that's kind of at the heart of some of the things we're going to talk about in this hour.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those questions were ones that drove me through actually initially religious studies, which is what this course that we're talking about today is centered in more of a religious studies context than theological. But we are doing stuff on philosophy of religion, so we get to explore some of these really interesting, big um, theological questions, like the problem of evil today. And like you, I had that similar conservative Christian background, as the students already know, and both of us have I think you would say probably too, you've moved away from a lot of those conservative foundations. But like, what with where you're at today, would you call yourself a progressive Christian, which is a category we're going to talk about later in the semester in this classes? If so, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I would call myself a Christian in the sense that I'm trying to follow Jesus. And
Mhm.
probably most people would call me a progressive Christian since I, don't believe a lot of the kind of standard things that I would attribute to more conservative Christians. Like, I don't think the Bible is completely error free. I don't think God puts presidents or leaders in power unilaterally. In other words, I have some differences of opinion from other Christians. um, what drives me the most, though, Austin, is I'm I feel this strong urge to try to live a life of love. And it's not like it's a new idea in my life. I felt like this when I was younger too. But I think when I was younger, I was a Christian first and a loving person second. Like I was on team Jesus, and I was there to, fight against the Mormons, who I didn't think were Christians at the time, and the Muslims and anybody else. I was on the right team, and then since I was on the right team, I ought to be loving. But today, it's love that motivates me first and foremost. And I'm still a Christian. I still try to follow Jesus. I still go to church. I still use a lot of Christian language, but it's love that compels me to try to engage my world and make sense of my world in view of a loving God and the call to love in my own life.
How do you relate to other religions? Um, I do think a lot of your work is mostly centered on speaking about theology and philosophy to fellow Christians, but there is a kind of generosity of spirit in the way that you approach these theological issues that seems to leave openness for dialogue and maybe even mutual transformation from other religions. Is that true?
Definitely true. Yes. I
Mhm.
learned from other religious traditions and other religious practitioners, people in particular, not just a general set of ideas. I
Mm.
think God is present in all of creation and acting in ways to self reveal to everyone at all times. So I've got no problems thinking that other religious traditions can provide truths and sources of help. That can supplement the Christian tradition, in some ways even inform the Christian tradition that I'm a part of. It's funny because just recently I was thinking how my life has changed in some ways. Because of the particular view of God that I have, of a God who's loving, all pervasive, always acting, not picking some people and liking them and hating others, not sending anybody to hell, a God who is uncontrolling. I actually have a lot more in common with some, not all, some Muslims, Mormons, Jews than I do with some Southern Baptists who are part of the Christian tradition. So it's weird. It's this view of God that I find compelling, and it's not a view that's just restricted to my own not only denomination but even my own Christian tradition. So there's a lot of the boundaries are not fixed for me when I think about other religious traditions.
That's cool. I wonder how much of like your shift towards more engagement within a religious dialogue and things came about through part of your graduate studies at Claremont, a place that both of us went to. Was that instrumental in that for you at
No,
all?
no doubt that it was. But even before then, I had been taking courses in other religious traditions, not only at the master's level, but also at a bachelor's level. And, when I went through my atheism stage, I was like, okay, if I'm going to still start believing in God again, then, maybe I ought to read widely and see if there's some other traditions that could give me information or
Mm.
help in some way. So, yeah, but my doctoral degree was helpful. Uh, this may sound strange because I'm a person who spends a lot of time wrestling with ideas, reading books, and that sort of thing. But it's actually my friendships with people in other traditions that have been probably the most transformative.
Cool.
It's hanging out with my Muslim friends and finding out they're really great people who are really smart, who have really good ideas. That's probably been more transformative than, reading the Quran or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, those personal connections are, I think, definitely are the way that things change for people and encountering any kind of real interpersonal differences, whether it's, people of different sexual orientations or other religions, like having personal connections to people in your life can really change people's way of
Yes.
approaching all kinds of different identities. So, in fact, in this class, hoping to get some other Zoom videos, fingers crossed, students with some folks from other religions, hopefully a rabbi and a Buddhist scholar that I'm friends with. But I wanted to talk to shift into some of the stuff about process theology or problem of evil in your work. Was going to Claremont? Were you motivated to go to Claremont, this school that both Tom and I went to? It's well known for having a lot of scholars who have engaged in pioneering this area of study called process theology. We're going to talk a little bit about today. Were you motivated to go to Claremont because of that, or were there other motivations for you?
I had been reading process theology before I applied to Claremont, and I knew that's where I wanted to go. I had become convinced that that general way of thinking was the most
Mm.
helpful, and so I wanted to go study with the best people. Now, I had some differences of opinion, some nuances. So like I wasn't full bore on all of the issues that maybe someone like John Cobb would have been in, but the general framework just made so much sense to me because I was committed to love, and not just when I say I'm committed to love, I don't mean I just wanted to be a loving person, although that's really important to me. I was committed to having a conceptual framework that would make sense of love. And so much of the Christian tradition that I had come from couldn't make good sense of love, at least as I understood it. And so when process theology came along with this idea of a God who is, I like to say, is uncontrolling or not omnipotent, I was like, oh, this could really help me with my big questions like, the problem of evil would be one, but a question like, if God is really omnipotent, then why doesn't God give everybody a crystal clear religious experience that they could have no doubts about? Or why doesn't God give us an inerrant Bible? Or why doesn't God fix all of these different religious traditions so we all got on the same page? An omnipotent God could do that. So these questions were undermining the sense that I thought that God would want to be fair and loving if God was omnipotent. But taking out that power thing said, oh, I said to myself, this now opens up the conversation in ways that could be really helpful.
How would you give a really brief, concise, accessible definition of process theology? And I also know you tend to use the phrase open and relational theology as the
Yes.
broader category. So maybe you can just say something about process theology just briefly and situate it in that broader umbrella category of open and relational
Yeah,
thinking.
I think I'll do it that way. I think I'll start with open and relational and then kind of narrow in on the particular form of process theology I find most attractive.
Cool.
The word open in open and relational theology has to do with a kind of idea that not a lot of people have thought about. It's the idea that God actually experiences time like we do, moment by moment. Most of the major theologians, not only in Christianity, but in Islam and some in Judaism, like Maimonides, they thought of God as being entirely timeless and somehow looking at all of history as if it's one moment. But open and relational thought thinks that God moves through time like we do, so that the past is past for God and the future has not yet happened. It's a realm of possibilities. So, this really historical God, that's a part of openness. And then the relational part is not only that you and I are interrelated and we're interrelated with creation, but God is also related, not only in the sense of influencing us, but us influencing God. There's a giving and receiving. And while that's a very common idea in the Christian scriptures and in the Quran, it's not common amongst the major theologians of those traditions. They've tended to say that God is totally, the word is impassible, unaffected, unmoved, unrelated. And open to relational thought says, no, God is giving and engaged and affected by what we do. So that's the big umbrella. Then underneath that, there's kinds of lots of variations, including lots of variations of process theology. But probably what process theology is most known for in the theological discussion is it says that God simply doesn't have the ability to control us. And not just us being free will creatures. God can't control the cells in my body. God can't control worms. God can't control viruses. God can't control everything from quarks to quasars. Now, the way that process folks will talk about God's inability to control kind of goes all different directions. But the way that I personally like to say it is this: I think God loves everyone and everything, and this love is inherently uncontrolling. So I think God loves quarks and queers and quasars and can't control anyone or anything, not because God's a weakling or uninvolved, but because God is really self giving, others empowering, and therefore uncontrolling. So process theology wants to rethink God's power in ways that gets rid of a controlling God. They do it in a lot of ways, but that's the particular way that I'm most attracted to.
That's really helpful framing of this, and I think it's really accessible for students who haven't heard of this stuff before. They've just read a fairly complex couple of chapters before they've read yours from this other famous theologian named David Bentley Hart, who they all know is a classical theist. You've already said a little bit about where you differ broadly, in open relational theology differs with classical theism, but you've and recently in social media, this is also why I'm asking the question, you've posed this question to a lot of us on social media, like about this notion of God being the infinite source of all being, right? Like that's kind of the infinite ground of all being is another term that Hart uses and Paul Tillich uses, of course, famously, and the students will be familiar with Tillich from previous discussions. Where does process theology differ on that framing of God as the infinite source of being? Because I think that'll be helpful for making this shift and like why it's really a quite striking alternative. And Hart himself has been critical of open theism and process theology, pretty much as far as I can tell, for the reason that process theologians criticize that notion that God is being itself or the ground of all being. What can you say about that to help us understand that distinction?
One of the problems that I remember thinking about as a youngster in my evangelical church was the problem that the way God was sometimes described, it sounded like God had a really big body and was living up somewhere in the clouds and may occasionally zap down or maybe even appear sometimes in bodily form, but God had a body out there. Now, the upside of thinking about that is it was easy to think of God as personal, as God is really interested in little Tommy Ord, and what he was doing, um, giving and receiving, engaged in my life. And that personal God was really attractive. But the downside was I couldn't imagine how that God who was up there could also be always present throughout all creation at all times, omnipresent, universal, all pervasive. What David Bentley Hart and others do well in talking about God as the ground of being is to give a sense that God is really right here with us, right now, in every single moment. God is all pervasive. But what they give up is that personal element. David Bentley Hart does not believe God engages in giving and receiving, does not think that anything that little Tommy Ord does actually has an effect on God. So they've got language that talks about God really being in and through everything that exists, but they give up the notion of a personal God that's so dominant in the scriptures. If you read the Bible very much, it sure seems like God is a real actor engaged in our lives. The beauty of open and relational and process thought is that we can keep both the idea that God is really present and engaged in us right here and right now, in the very being of the world in our own lives, and God is personal. God is really acting and interested and affected by what little Tommy Orr does when he's 12-year old in little farming town in Washington State. And that means, I think, that we have a better way of accounting for not only the all pervasiveness of God, but the real loving person of God, which is so important to me.
Just to kind of play devil's advocate with Hart just a little bit, I wanted to see how you would respond to a couple of his criticisms. I found a short, like 3-minute video clip where he was briefly criticizing open and relational theology, open theism, process theology. And so far as I could tell, and knowing some of his other writings, I guess the main thing he thinks, I mean, first of all, he thinks that open theism with this emphasis on love, he calls it warm and fuzzy, and that it gives up on some of the logical rigor that he thinks classical theism has. When it gets so warm and fuzzy, it gives up on the more logical, in his view, answer to the perennial question of why anything exists at all, right? The why is there something rather than nothing? And I think that's central to what we just wrestled with in Hart. That he says, the main reason, the best argument for the existence of God for him is that cosmological argument from contingency that answers the problem of why there's something rather than nothing. How do you respond to that? How can your framework provide a different answer to those kinds of concerns that Hart raises?
Yeah, let me come in quick at the beginning and say I think the cosmological argument is the worst argument for
Oh,
arguing
interesting.
for God's existence, because I don't see any reason why we can't, in theory, think that the universe has always been existing, that it's an everlasting chain of causes. Now, what someone like David Bentley Hart, or even more so William Lane Craig, will say is they'll say, well, there's only one being that's everlasting. There's only one being that's uncaused. And you have to assume there's this God who then causes everything else. But of course, they think that one being is everlasting. So they have a metaphysical ultimate in their category that they think generates everything else. What I think is the beautiful thing about process thought, at least my own version of it, is that we can think that God is ultimate, but also God is everlastingly creative. And so instead of there being an absolute first cause to creation, we can say God is continually creating, and there's always been some universe or another. Now that kind of sounds abstract to a lot of people, like who cares if, we say God was all alone at first and then decided to create, versus God has always been creating, so there's always been creaturely others with God. Well, it makes a difference when it comes back to the subject of our talk here, and that is the subject of evil. If God has the kind of ability to create something out of nothing, the kind of omnipotence to single handedly produce X out of non X, then it seems like God retains the kind of power to fix all kinds of problems in our world and our lives in particular. So the questions of evil and God's power actually are influenced by the question of whether or not God is the lone first cause of everything, or as I would prefer to say, God is everlastingly creating. God's the only necessarily everlasting individual, but there's been a series of creations that are contingent that God has always been doing.
Yeah, that's a
And
really helpful contrast to what we just wrestled with Hart, I think. that there's very distinct cosmologies going on here,
Yes.
right? Creation ex nihilo is Hart's model. And what's the phrase you prefer to use for your alternative to creation out of nothing?
Creation out of creation in love everlastingly. I've got some
Yeah,
Latin I could throw in there too, but
yeah.
yeah, that's the basic
that'll
idea.
that'll do. Well, I want to shift then more directly onto the problem of evil, because that's, I think, we can argue with David Hart about the question of God as being itself and all of these different divine attributes that we wrestled with together in this class over the last couple of weeks. But at the end of the day, like, probably the central issue I think you probably have with that classical theistic model of God is that it fails to answer this really tough problem of the problem of evil, which I think I've heard some philosophers say, like, it's the number one reason people become atheists is the
Yeah.
inability to answer that question. And classical theism, even by Hart's own admission, he will admit, in other places, that this is, one of the most challenging things about holding the classical theistic line. I appreciate that he's at least honest about that. So, like,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
you, let's define the problem of evil, and I'd like to know, what like really kind of amplified that problem. What were there events in your life, or there were events in world history that really made this such a central problem for you as a theologian, so central that you've written quite a few books now to provide a logical and spiritually satisfying answer to this problem? What were those shifts for you
Yeah.
like?
I can't really look back and say there was one major event in my life. There have been many events, I've had
Mm-hmm.
friends die and things like that, and people mistreat me. But I think if you looked at my life and compared it with the lives of most people on the planet, you'd say, Tom's probably in the upper half of people who've had a good life in terms of what's been done to him, or the people he'd been around that have been hurt. But I really wanted to think that God was loving. And so it was a very theoretical kind of issue alongside the real instances of pain and evil in the world. Now, the question of what counts for evil is a really tricky one, because I think we can all agree that some things that one person might think is evil, another person might think is good. I grew up on a farm and we liked it when there was lots of rain, but the people in town, when they were going to have their picnic, they didn't like it when there was rain. So is rain really evil or good? And well, it kind of depends on what you want. And some people will look at everything that happens in the world, from the Holocaust to genocide to rape or whatever, and they'll say, well, if you look at it and you kind of squint, maybe it is really good from the divine perspective because, we're all going to learn a lesson from it, or it's going to build character, or we just have to have that as a possibility if we're going to have real free will, or whatever. There's all kinds of ways to think about it. I think we ought to define evil, a genuine evil, as an event that makes the world worse than it otherwise might have been. So, if in any particular situation we can easily imagine some other event happening that would have been better, then we have reasons to wonder if something in this particular case was evil. So, we can bring up the horrendous things like, let's say, a mass murder. I can easily imagine the world better if, that person hadn't killed all those people. So, it seems like that could be a real genuine evil. Now, that seems kind of theoretic. So someone might say, well, you've got your nice little argument, but I don't think there are any evils in the world. I just go around seeing things that are painful and say, well, that's, they're painful, but they're not genuinely evil. And to that person, I say, I really don't think you live like you believe there's no genuine evils. I think that if we walked around and observed your behavior, that sometimes you'd feel guilty for doing some things that you think you shouldn't have done. Sometimes you'd get upset with other people for doing things you think they could have avoided. You actually live your life as if you think genuine evils occur. Yeah, maybe sometimes we have differences of opinions on what's evil and what's not. But if we all live our lives as if we think some things make the world worse than it otherwise might have been, and if we think there's a God, then we need to somehow come to terms with that. And what most believers have done, whether Christian or not, they've not really given us a full solution to this problem. Some have sort of said, well, um, as I said earlier, all the painful things are actually necessary for some greater good, a soul making kind of defense. Other people have said, well, I don't have an answer to that. I'm just going to, punt to mystery. But there are other reasons that I'm going to bring to the table why I think God exists, and they just kind of go on from there. Some people will appeal to human free will, which I also appeal to, but they won't extend that to other parts of creation, so that they'll say, well, God respects the free will of the, I don't know, the embezzler, but God doesn't. Uh, but God, there is no free will in viruses or whatever. So I think there's a lot of attempts to try to make some sense of it, but David Bentley Hart is right that it's the number one, or if he's the one who said it, it's the number one reason people turn away from belief in God, and it is rarely um, solved, or at least people in the academy don't really try to solve it. The best they want to do is give some sort of defense for why they can still believe in God, but they don't really solve this question.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like a lot of the traditional responses or theodicies, the responses to the problem of evil, it seems like a lot of them take that similar route of, even if they don't say it out loud, it seems like there is that denial of genuine evil.
Yeah.
That they're really like, there's some a variety of answers just seem to kind of boil down to, well, it's all part of some higher purpose or plan. Most of what they're arguing comes down to not being able to really admit that there's genuine evil in the world. And I think that's a really powerful part of your argument. Is there a theodicy, though, other than your own, or a response to the problem of evil that you think is pretty good, but like, is it the free will defense that you would say is really the best alternative to your own, or is there another one?
Probably, since I incorporate some of that in mine,
Mhm.
probably the free will defense. The one
Yeah.
that really bugs me the most, but does have some virtues, the one
Mm,
that bugs me the most is what in the academy is called skeptical theism. And this is
mm.
the idea that people will affirm the kind of classical views of God, including God's omnipotence. But then when it comes to the problem of evil, they'll punt to mystery. They'll say, we just don't have enough data to come down on this issue and to know why God doesn't stop. And that really bugs the heck out of me, because I look at that response and say, you're not willing to rethink your view of God in light of what our experience is, and that's just not playing fair. But at least those folks will claim that there are genuine evils in the world, which is
Yeah.
not what other people will do. Other people will, like the soul making theodicy, they'll say, well, it's somehow for God's greater good or purpose, or and yeah, I don't buy that either.
Another thing you said that I just wanted to comment on that was running through my mind, you were sort of implying the issue of, there's free will, that God, in traditional theodicies can respect human freedom, but then there's the issue of the freedom of the rest of the world, and God apparently, allows a lot of natural disasters to happen and natural evils, right? And maybe
Right.
you can kind of just make that distinction for us real quick, and how your theodicy answers not just the problem with moral evil, the misuse of human freedom, but also the challenges of natural disasters and climate change, that God doesn't seem to be stopping. If God exists, God doesn't seem to be stopping these things anytime soon.
Yeah, let me answer that by kind of laying out a few models here. All right. So, one model would be God controls everything. What you think is human free will is not really free will. God's really controlling you. Everything that happens, good, bad, ugly, or beautiful, God did it because God controls it all. Uh, I, not a lot of people actually hold that view, but it's on the table. It's out there. A much more common view says this: God gives free will to humans and maybe dogs and dolphins, but some of the complex creatures, we have freedom, and God usually doesn't override that freedom. Can, maybe occasionally will, but usually doesn't. But God controls the worms, the cells, and the quarks. Everything down below some particular level is doesn't have any agency, doesn't have any spontaneity or integrity of its own. God is in control at that level. And the problem with that, as you point out, is that, let's say, fire, well, that doesn't seem to have any agency on this particular view that I'm outlining. And so, if God can control that, then why doesn't God just stop the fires? Bingo, like that. Um, I think it's more plausible to think that not only humans have freedom, but even the smallest units have some kind of agency or spontaneity. There's, as many physicists speculate, there's indeterminacy even at the quantum level. And if that's the case, then we can understand why God can't stop fires or can't stop coronaviruses or can't stop hurricanes or whatever, because even the most fundamental units of reality have some agency that God doesn't control. And my argument from earlier was God is a God of love, and love is inherently uncontrolling. And if God loves everyone, top to bottom, simple to complex, then that love won't control fire, won't control quarks, won't control hurricanes. Not won't because God decides not to, but won't because God simply can't. In fact, let me I'm guessing that some of the folks watching this um, might be wondering if I'm saying that God is choosing not to control. So we in the academy we call this a voluntary divine self-limitation, and that's pretty popular. Pretty popular.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
I'm not affirming that view. I like to sometimes put my view between two kind of other views. This one is the one I've just mentioned, that God could control others, but is voluntarily deciding not to, at least most of the time. And then the view on the other side of me is the idea that somehow God is being constrained by external forces. Maybe it's the devil, if you believe in a devil, or maybe it's the natural laws, or even metaphysical laws can sound like they're external to God. And so God's like, oh man, I'd really like to stop the fire right now, but that thing out there is preventing me, this external force. The position I'm trying to propose is that it's God's own nature, it's internal to God, that makes it the case that God simply can't control others. God's nature of love is inherently uncontrolling. It's not a choice on God's part, as if God wakes up and says, should I be loving today? No, it's God's very nature to do so. But it's also not the case that some devil or laws outside of God are somehow constraining God.
Mm.
That's the view that I find most compelling.
That's a helpful explanation of this notion of amipotence or
Yes.
amipotence, however you want to say it, I guess. Would you say like that is kind of your essential solution to the problem of evil?
Yeah, I'm bold enough to say that it's a real solution. It's a solution in the sense that it gives us a reason why God simply can't prevent the genuine evils of the world. I think there's other aspects of that in a book I think, are you having the folks read some of God Can't, or is it, which is,
You
no,
know,
you're
it's
reading
from
the other
the
one.
Death of
That's right. Yeah.
Omnipotence.
Well, let me, if some of the folks who are a part of this want to have read a little more on this, I wrote a book called God Can't, that in the 5 chapters of the book, I lay out a five-fold answer. The biggest one is the one we're talking about here, that God simply can't control evil. But I also talk about how we can think about God trying to heal, God suffering with those who suffer, so empathizing, God trying to squeeze some good out of the bad God didn't want in the first place, and also the idea that God is calling upon us and all creation to work with God to overcome evil with good. So
Mm.
it's those things all together, I think, make a real solution to this problem.
I think it's easy to understand how God can then, as love, as loving, can influence humans, right? Like God is for you, God is a divine lure or call, enticing humanity to live more loving lives. It's a pretty straightforward understanding. And I think that really helps give an alternative framing to this problem at the level of the human. But when it comes to saying that, like, what is a God of love? Like, what does it mean to say God's love extends to the rest of the natural world? Like, how does that translate? Because, quantum particles, as you just said, maybe those are, have their kind of own indeterminacies that allows some sort of cooperative influence between God, and even at the quantum level, God's influence or action is defined by love. How do you translate that to
Yeah,
non-human entities or processes?
that's a really good question. There are two, I think, key ideas to help make headway here. One is something that's called panpsychism or pan-experientialism, or my pet little label is material mental monism. And that's the idea that every entity that exists has both a physical and a mental element to it, a material and a mental element. So, quarks, let's say, have some tiny iota of mentality. Now, that may seem really strange to say, but if you think this is the case, then you've got good grounds to imagine how greater mentality over time can emerge to the kind of consciousness that we all assume and live in our day-to-day lives. And it can help us understand actions among cells and all kinds of things in the world. So this idea of panpsychism or pan-experientialism, that all of reality has some element of mentality, that can help us when we think about God's love for even the smallest entities of reality. God wants their well-being as well as the well-being of complex creatures. And then the second big idea that's important is that I can imagine people hearing me saying, okay, well, maybe this works. I can see worms might have agency and some small degree of mentality, maybe cells. Okay, for the sake of, I don't know, explanatory consistency, let's put it down to the quarks. But what about the rock in my front yard? Are you trying to tell me, Tom, that the rock is thinking? No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that rocks are thinking beings. What's important here is to distinguish between animate and inanimate, or sometimes people call it organisms and aggregates. It can be the case that these entities can be constructed or comprised or organized in different kinds of ways. Sometimes they're organized like an organism, they have some continuity, some organizational symmetry. But other times they're more like rocks, bits that are kind of clunked together that don't have any unity in and of themselves. So that's kind of a complex philosophical discussion, but that's one way to start thinking through how God can love absolutely everything, top to bottom.
You've given us a really good, I think, outline of what your process cosmology, including this panpsychist or material mental monism, how that fits into that and helps to sort of coordinate with this notion that God is uncontrolling love and how that works with divine influence. And I wanted to ask you maybe one or two final questions. And the
Great.
first one's this, we can kind of see the alternative to classical theism. But earlier you said that, you've given some sense of why you believe in God in the first place. Why go all to this trouble to try to provide a framework to make sense of God and the world and divine action and so forth and evil? Um, you said that David Bentley Hart's argument that the cosmological argument is your least favorite or the worst argument for God. What then for Tom are the best reasons to believe in God? Like, why not just go atheist? Because a lot of people are just like, man, like this is complicated. Atheism just is kind of like clean solution. You and I know a lot of people who have gone that route in the face of evil, I think. What are the best reasons not to go that route in your view?
Yeah. Well, I think there are quite a few. One of them is that as I try to make sense of my life and existence, it's hard for me to make good sense of it, especially the beauty and the complexity and the design and all those kinds of things, if there isn't some kind of goad or prompt or designer or beautician. I don't know if that's a good word. Artist. Let's go with that one. An artist. And if this artist is uncontrolling, is not omnipotent, then I can account for all the ugliness in the world as well. So, uh, 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 speculating that there's a capital A artist in the world who can't control, I think helps me make sense of the beauty and design and wonder and glory I see in the world. So there's one reason I do. Another reason is I said earlier that I would like for my life to have meaning, that there was some kind of ultimate meaning to reality. I can't prove that. I'm not saying this is a, slam dunk argument, but things would make more sense and my life would have purpose and meaning if there was some sort of framework, some sort of a way to talk about my life making a real difference. Now, a lot of people believe in God and think that God is the ground of meaning, but they don't have good reasons to talk about them as individuals having any ultimate significance because God doesn't really need them. God is going to omnipotently do everything, or at least do the stuff that's most important, and their lives don't really matter to that kind of God. The kind of God I've described here actually needs us, actually is calling upon us and all creation to work toward love, beauty, and justice. And if we don't, God can't clean up the mess single handedly. That means, I know that sounds scary to some people, but to me, that invigorates me. Like, yes, my life can make a difference. This framework for thinking about God means that having conversations with you, Austin, and your students actually could have true meaning in the world. And that's important. And there's some others, but I just say one more, even because I've mentioned it earlier. Um, I think the intuitions we all have to love cannot be fully explained by our environment, evolutionary history, our culture, our genes, our neurons. I think all of those contribute. So I'm not denying the influence of those things. But I think this deep intuition to love, and the hope that love is ultimately what matters most, that's part of my argument for why I think there's a God.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end it, Tom. I really appreciate you just taking this time and outlining your perspective. I mean, I think the students, whether or not they end up agreeing with your theology here, I'm excited to hear what they think, and we're going to have some discussions and some debates, I hope, about their views, whether they're atheists or not. But I think you've given a really powerful framework to help interpret some of the theistic religions that we're going to go into. I think, I guess one last little question is, do you have any traction with this framework with, like, are there other religious folks who are utilizing these ideas in other religions? Can you
Definitely,
give us a couple of
yes.
examples of that?
Swami Padmanabha is a Hindu who's using this. Shai Held, and Brad Artson, he's
Right.
a process
Hmm.
person. Shai
Hmm.
Held, a couple of Jewish rabbis who find
Hmm.
this way of thinking attractive. A couple Muslims, Saida Mirsadri, you probably know Farhan Shah, um, and some others. So those are folks from other religious traditions who might not agree with every little thing that I just said, but have that same general kind of framework that we share in common. I'd like
Well,
to say one more thing, if that's okay, Austin.
yeah, yeah.
There's one matter that really concerned me a great deal when I was younger. And my working through this issue has helped me not only in my way of thinking about God and other religions, but also, as you said a moment ago, make me not feel like those who might disagree with me are doomed.
Hmm.
And that is, I don't believe in hell. I don't believe God sends anyone to eternal conscious torment. Now, when I was a younger Christian, I thought heaven and hell were at stake. And so having the right views was mattered the most because my Mormon friends were going to hell because they had the wrong God. Today, I still believe in God and a God of love. I think some views of God aren't as good as others. But if someone hears me lay out the ideas I've just given right now and they disagree strongly, I don't think to myself, well, they're got hell to pay for that. I
That's
think
good.
to myself, well, hey, we can have differences of opinion, and the God I believe in loves us and is luring us all toward more truth.
Good, good. Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I remember, when I first started studying other religions and other theologies, other than this super conservative Pentecostal theology I was raised in until I was 16. Yeah, that fear of, if your answers are wrong, like you're going to end up somewhere you don't want to be for eternity. And so
Right.
having a more open perspective on the afterlife is actually really important for having the true freedom to explore other religious and theistic answers to these perennial questions. I appreciate that qualification. That's
Yeah.
helpful.
Well,
So
thanks for the chance to chat. I appreciate it, Austin.
yeah, yeah, I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for your time, Tom. I will look forward to connecting with you another time soon. Hopefully, AR maybe at the end of the year or something like that. We'll have a chance to reconnect. But thank you for all your work. I think at the very least, again, whether or not the students agree with everything you said, I think with the clarity and the generosity of your spirit in bringing these ideas to us, that designation is one of the most influential theologians of the 21st century. I think it's well deserved. So thank you for sharing with us, Tom.
You're welcome.
All right, talk to you soon.
Okay.